The DP-420 exam is a certification exam for developers who want to design and implement cloud-native applications using Microsoft Azure Cosmos DB. The exam covers topics such as data models, data distribution, integration, optimization, and maintenance of Azure Cosmos DB solutions. The exam also tests the candidate's proficiency in using the SQL API and SDK for Azure Cosmos DB, as well as writing efficient queries and creating index policies. Passing the exam validates the candidate's skills and knowledge in working with Azure Cosmos DB database technologies and prepares them for the role of Azure Cosmos DB Developer Specialist. 1. You need to create a database in an Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL account. The database will contain 3 containers named Call1, Call2 and Call3. The Call1 container will have unpredictable read and write volumes. The Call2 and Call3 containers will have predictable read and write volumes. The expected maximum throughput for Call1 and Call2 is 50,000 request units per second, RU/s, each. How should you provision the collection while minimizing costs? A. Create a provisioned throughput account. Set the throughput for Call1 to manual. Set the throughput for Call2 and Call3 to autoscale. B. Create a provisioned throughput account. Set the throughput for Call1 to autoscale. Set the throughput for Call2 and Call3 to manual. C. Create a serverless account. 2. You have an Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL account that has multiple write regions. You need to receive an alert when requests that target the database exceed the available request units per second, RU/s. Which Azure Monitor signal should you use? A. Region removed. B. Document quota. C. Metadata requests. D. Data usage. 3. You have an Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL account named Account1 that has a single read-write region and 1 additional read region. Account1 uses the strong default consistency level. You have an application that uses the eventual consistency level when submitting requests to Account1. How will writes from the application be handled? A. Writes will use the strong consistency level. B. Azure Cosmos DB will reject writes from the application. C. The write order is not guaranteed during replication. D. Writes will use the eventual consistency level. 4. You have a container named container. In an Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL account, you need to provide a user named user1 with the ability to insert items into container1 by using role-based access. The solution must use the principle of least privilege. Which roles should you assign to user1? A. Cosmos DB built-in data contributor only. B. Cosmos DB operator only. C. Document DB account contribute only. D. Document DB account contributor and Cosmos DB built-in data contributor. 5. You have a database in an Azure Cosmos DB Core SQL API account. The database is backed up every 2 hours. You need to implement a solution that supports point-in-time restore. What should you do first? A. Enable continuous backup for the account. B. Configure the backup and restore settings for the account. C. Create a new account that has a periodic backup policy. D. Configure the point-in-time restore settings for the account. 6. You need to implement a trigger in Azure Cosmos DB Core SQL API that will run before an item is inserted into a container. Which two actions should you perform to ensure that the trigger runs? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. Append pre to the name of the JavaScript function trigger. B. For each create request, set the access condition in request options. C. Register the trigger as a pre-trigger. D. For each create request, set the consistency level to session in request options. E. For each create request, set the trigger name in request options. 7. You have a container named Container1 in an Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL account named Account1 that is set to the session default consistency level. The average size of an item in Container1 is 20 kilobytes. You have an application named App1 that uses the Azure Cosmos DB SDK and performs a point read on the same set of items in Container1 every minute. You need to minimize the consumption of the request units (RUS) associated to the reads by App1. What should you do? A. In Account1, change the default consistency level to bounded staleness. B. In App1, change the consistency level of read requests to consistent prefix. C. In Account1, provision a dedicated gateway and integrated cache. D. In App1, modify the connection policy settings. 8. You have a container named Container1 in an Azure Cosmos DB Core SQL API account. You need to provide a user named User1 with the ability to insert items into Container1 by using role-based access control (RBAC). The solution must use the principle of least privilege. Which roles should you assign to User1? A. Cosmos DB operator only. B. Document DB account contributor and Cosmos DB built-in data contributor. C. Document DB account contributor only. D. Cosmos DB built-in data contributor only. 9. You have a database named DB1 in an Azure Cosmos DB. If you have a third-party application that is exposed through, you need to migrate data from the application to a. What should you use? A. Database Migration Assistant. B. Azure Data Factory. C. Azure Migrate. 10. You plan to store order data in Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL account. The data contains information about orders and their associated items. You need to develop a model that supports order read operations. The solution must minimize the number or requests. A. Create a single database that contains one container. Store orders and order items in separate documents in the container. B. Create a single database that contains one container. Create a separate document for each order and embed the order items into the order documents. C. Create a database for orders and a database for order items. D. Create a single database that contains a container for order and a container for order items.